Powell laid out the reasons behind the central bank's first decision on interest rates in 2026. Karin Caifa is in Washington with that decision and what Powell had to say about the outlook for the U.S. economy. Karin, good to see you.
Good to see you, Annie. And Chairman Powell really did try to keep his focus in his remarks to reporters after the announcement on the economy, despite all that has been swirling about the debates around the Fed's independence, because this is something that really impacts every American consumer who borrows money. The Federal Reserve holding its benchmark rate steady for the first time since last July.
Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell on the central bank's first interest rate decision of 2026.
In support of our goals, today the Federal Open Market Committee decided to leave our policy rate unchanged.
The Federal Reserve taking its time bringing interest rates down and seeing little urgency, with government data pointing to slower job growth but a relatively low unemployment rate and inflation ebbing, even as consumer sentiment numbers point to Americans being in a sour economic mood.
Inflation data has been looking a little bit better and trending in the right direction. And then you have these consumer sentiment numbers really falling off a cliff, indicating that consumers are really worried about their jobs right now.
President Donald Trump sharply critical of Powell, insisting lower interest rates would spur greater economic growth by encouraging consumers and businesses to borrow and buy, spend, and hire.
I'd like to see interest rates go down. Everything else is going down. We have the energy and fuel going down.
The central bank did cut rates 3 times last year as it monitored the economic effects of Trump's policies, especially his broad global tariff plan.
And Powell did answer a question about criticism by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent of Powell's attendance at Supreme Court arguments last week around the case surrounding Lisa Cook, the Fed governor who was fired by President Trump last year due to unproven mortgage fraud allegations. Powell said he attended those arguments in an unprecedented way because it was, quote, perhaps the most important legal case in the Fed's history. Annie?
Karin, before we let you go, Chairman Powell also gave more details behind the Fed's outlook for the economy. Of course, this is on the minds of many Americans. What did he have to say about employment and inflation in the year ahead?
Well, the Fed sounded a little bit more upbeat about the labor market than they did at the end of 2025, Annie. Remember, this was something that they were watching very closely and factored into those rate cuts that they made at the end of 2025 in the fall. Powell said that perhaps the unemployment rate has stabilized here. We saw it about 4.4% at the last jobs report. Of course, something they will keep looking at as they make future decisions. Inflation remains a little bit more elevated than where the Federal Reserve would like to see it. Powell says that the Fed thinks that tariffs have kind of worked their way into the system. The pass-through to consumers is complete when it comes to any kind of price inflation that has to do with those tariffs. But again, something they'll monitor. He pointed to some weakness in the housing market, but said overall, the U.S. economy starting 2026 on solid footing. And Annie, that's a little bit different than the consumer sentiment surveys we're hearing that show Americans still don't feel great about where their finances are.
Yeah, a lot of Americans still not feeling great and a lot of uncertainty ahead. Karin, thank you so much.